Today we've got a great presentation lined up for you, which is very timely. It's close to home for many of us. Unfortunately today our first responders find themselves responding to more active threat events with our fellow police officers and Brothers in Blue. Townsville, Manual 9, we're not immune to this. So today we have a good treat for you. This morning we have Chief Otto Drozd from Orange County, Florida, Fire and Rescue. Chief Drozd began his fire service career in 1986, and I'm not even going to try to say Hialeah Fire Department, is that right?
Hialeah.
There you go, thank you. We're going to play the fire chief in 2001. In 2009, Chief Drozd was appointed to the fire chief of the El Paso, Texas Fire Department. The first fire chief appointed from outside prior to returning to Florida to assume the helm of Orange County Fire and Rescue. Chief Drozd holds a bachelor's degree at Florida Atlantic University and a master's degree from St. Thomas University, both in public management. He's a graduate of the National Fire Academy's Executive Fire Officer Program, a designated chief officer from the Commission on Professional Credential, and attended Harvard University's Kennedy School of Fire Service Fellowship. Chief Drozd is a frequent speaker and presenter at NFPA Expo, Fire Rescue International, Firehouse, Fire Rescue East, Congressional Fire Service Institute, the Metro Fire Chiefs, and other local fire service events. He's active at local and state and national levels and currently serves as president of IAFC and NFPA, Metropolitan Fire Chiefs Association, and is the second vice president of the International Association of Fire Chiefs. Chief Drozd was the proposer of the NFPA 3000 and serves on the technical committee. Please join me in welcoming Chief Drozd for his presentation.
Thank you. Well, and it's a pleasure to be here, and certainly to see this many people on a Sunday morning at a conference, no less, to be here at this presentation. Certainly I'm honored to be here. So there's a lot of material that I'm going to cover, and we're going to go through it pretty quickly. So the discussion outline you see before you, we're going to go over some of the active shooter incidents within the United States. And when we say within the United States, that's a good area of focus, because while we represent about 5% of the world's population, we have about 31% of active shooter incidents. And that's not a political statement, that's just a fact. So we'll go through the Pulse nightclub shooting, which if you know Florida, Orange County is in the Orlando area. Orlando resides within Orange County. So on that night, we were the largest mutual aid agency, responding 19 units and over 41 personnel. Then industry best practice, the inception of, or the genesis of NFPA 3000, what that really represents and how that's breaking, in some quarters, what's new ground for our fire service in coordination with a lot of other public safety entities. We'll look at what's contained within it, and then hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. So, active shooter in the United States has a long history going back to the Texas Tower shooting in 1966 that killed 15 and injured 31. But from that time, it really wasn't until Columbine High School that it really became something that was at the forefront of our consciousness and really at the forefront of the fire service. Because if you remember what happened at Columbine, there was a methodology in place that said, okay, when there's a violent event, police are going to go in and they're going to secure a building. So what happened in Columbine, there was people that bled out over 3 hours. If you think of this building on its own that we're sitting in right now, if we were to wait for police units to get here, secure means that all threat is removed from the building, how long would that take? So it really began to change the mindset of how we operate. And in the early days, what happened is fire departments started building, well, let's look at SWAT medic teams that can go in with them. But those are really established to protect the police officers. So this is really where we started kind of shifting our thoughts on how to respond to active shooter. So Virginia Tech in 2007, at the time, the worst shooting in U.S. history. in 2007. And you can see with the number of injured and killed, that was something that was still kind of unusual within the United States. But unfortunately, it's becoming more of the norm. Each and every week, we're seeing, something happen, if not week, month. Then we have Aurora, Colorado. And so when we talked about that paradigm shift of actually being able to enter buildings a little bit quicker, it still hadn't taken hold by this time because there was still a large delay in being able to get the appropriate personnel and units to the scene. Now, if you look at some of the history with Aurora, and I believe we're at risk as a fire service industry, we're at risk because if we take the position that we're not going to go in and we're not going to affect these rescues, when in some cases we're capable of doing it, then we risk our credibility within communities. And that's really what we trade on, is our credibility within those. So now we get to, the Charleston church shooting. And the reason I put this up is to show that nobody's immune. This can happen in any place within the United States, any place in the world. And we had the Townsend Elementary School shooting, which the killer was actually stopped by firefighters that actually stopped this. So whether large town or small town or anything in between, it could happen. In fact, we had, of course, the Pulse Night shooting. Now, if you remember, we said Virginia Tech 2007. The Pulse shooting replaced that as the worst mass shooting in U.S. history, about 9 years removed from Virginia Tech. Now, 1 year later, 1 calendar year later, we have Las Vegas. So these things are happening more rapidly, and the death tolls are becoming worse. And we're going to get into the Pulse and show you how that could have been much, much worse. And then when you talk about small rural towns, Sutherland Springs, Texas, a church shooting. In fact, when this happened, there was a debate within the fire service, within the committee that I was serving on, as to whether what we were doing was relevant to all types of communities. In fact, one of the biggest opponents of some of the provisions originally within NFPA 3000 was some of our volunteer elements. And not because they didn't want to do it, they just thought they couldn't afford to do it in some cases, that they didn't have the resources to do it, and that the risk of it happening within their communities was so low that it shouldn't be part of the standard. Now, I can tell you, after this happened, I received a phone call, and they said, you know what? I'm sorry. It can happen anywhere. And we're on board. And so the challenge is really balancing what the risk is within each one of your individual communities and having the appropriate resources to deal with that risk. Now, Parkland, Florida, certainly while this one, 17 dead and 15 injured, this raised a whole slew of other issues when it comes to school shootings and how we protect schools. And we'll touch on that a little bit, but this one really showed what an emotional impact these types of incidents can have and the long range effects that they can have when you're talking about the politics behind some of these shootings. Now, if you look at 2000 to 2013, these are the numbers. The remarkable part about this is that in the first half of this time period, we were averaging about 6.4 shootings per year. By the second half of that had increased between 2007 and 2013 to 16.4 per year. So just in that time frame, it had been increasing. Now, you look at Now we're looking from 13 to 17. We went for almost 100 more incidents in half the time. So it's happening more and more. And when we look at just 16 and 17, 50 incidents in 21 states. Now, it not only happens in the big states, because what's represented up there is Florida, Texas, California, but you also have Kentucky and some of the smaller states that have these incidents happening just within the last 2 years. You can see the number of casualties, along with 221 killed and over 700 wounded. So it really shows that it is something that can happen anywhere and is happening everywhere. Now, this represents the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history. It has, some of the older ones, to be sure. It has the Austin Tower shooting there back in '66. It has some dated ones, going back to 1984, 1991. But if you look at the majority of them and you look at the dates of the majority of them, these are happening within the scope of our careers, within this time period. Parkland in 18, Orlando 16, Virginia Tech 07, Newton in Connecticut in 12, San Bernardino 15, Las Vegas 17. These are all happening in a very compressed time frame. So if there's any doubt that this is something that we should be dealing with, the numbers really tell the story. Now, where is it happening? Generally, we would say that 70% of them happen in educational facilities or business, commerce. Well, Las Vegas changed that with their shooting at the Harvest 91 festival that happened in open space. So that is changing the numbers a little bit. So you can see all the different types, and really each one of your communities probably has elements of all of these within them. So when we talk about the risk assessment and those things that you need to consider within your communities, it really goes back to where these events are happening. Now, prior to the Pulse shooting, we did have a near miss within our jurisdiction at the University of Central Florida, which for those of you that don't know UCF, beyond the football team, it's the second largest university in the United States with over 60,000 students within UCF. So what happened there was somebody that was a student that had planned it out, was in the dorm, had a gun, had the ammunition, came out and was confronted serendipitously by his roommate. And he went to pull the trigger and the gun jammed. So he went back to the interior of the dorm and killed himself, which that was actually fortunate because what his plan was to pull the fire alarm and to do his killing at the gathering places. So this really got us thinking, yes, it can happen to us too. So we started doing a lot of training. We implemented the SAVE training. We bought ballistic vests and when I say SAVE training, that is Swift Assisted Victim Extrication, which is done as part of an RTF with law enforcement. And there's many different iterations of that type of training that are out there, and we'll talk about some of that as well. And we had deployed ballistics on our battalion units. And that was what, at the time, I thought, and we thought, was okay because of the frequency of these events. But I would ask the question of the group, are you responding to violent events on a daily basis within your jurisdictions? And I think by everybody nodding, you're responding to them. And so I've taken a little bit different view. And so when we dispatch calls, we dispatch them as potentially violent events. And based on some of the things and the experiences that we've had, we now put ballistic vests and helmets on every riding seat. Much like we have SCBAs, We have them on every riding seat. They're adjustable with the side cummerbunds so that they can be adjusted in the morning, just like you would adjust your straps on your SCBAs. They go in and they adjust their ballistics. Now, the Pulse nightclub shooting, almost 2.5 years removed now, June 12th, 2016, and still relevant when it comes to those things that happened, those things that we need to improve on as a service. And when I talk to people about after actions, and we all do after actions to a certain extent, and we're really focusing on those things that we could do to improve. But what I tell my folks is when we do after actions, we're looking at those things that went wrong. And in most cases, if we were to score it out, an after action on most of our scenes, we're looking at the 5 or 10% that went wrong, and we're sometimes overlooking the 90% that went right. So I preface that to say that I think, as a fire service, we get it right most of the time, but we owe it to ourselves to focus on those areas where we can improve. And certainly there was those here. So on June 12th, 2 a.m., 77 degrees, 85% humidity, a building that can be found in any one of your jurisdictions. Just under 5,000 square feet, occupancy of 300 at the time. And so this is really a telltale here. You see the Pulse nightclub, and you see how close it is to Orlando Fire Station number 5. And there's been a good bit of controversy on the actions of the crews there, and we'll get into that a little bit. And then you see the only trauma center at the top of the screen. That represents less than 3/4 of a mile. So while there were 49 deaths, but for the location, the life loss at the Pulse incident would have been much, much greater. In fact, immediately prior to the Pulse event, I had been at DC talking to DHS and talking to a lot of our legislators because the Orlando area had lost its Urban Area Securities Initiative designation. It had dropped off the list. And my contention was that, since 9/11 to now, that formula had been based on critical infrastructure. And the face of terrorism has changed. What you're seeing is soft targets of opportunity, and certainly this was one. You have those in your jurisdictions, no doubt. And really, we have to change our focus because those things that we block off, like we're dealing with active shooter now, once we get a handle on that, the next one's peeking its head around the corner, and we have to be prepared and maybe a little bit more flexible than that hard infrastructure focus. Now, the Pulse incident, this is the layout of the club. So this is where it started transpiring. At 2 a.m., the shooter entered the nightclub through the front door, and right on the main dance floor, started shooting a high-powered rifle. And he didn't just shoot once. As bodies went down, he would come and spray again to make sure that they were deceased. The call comes in for multiple shots at the Pulse nightclub, and you saw the distance from the Pulse nightclub to the fire station, and that we'll go over in a little bit. And in a matter of minutes, 20 calls come into the communications center notifying of the Pulse nightclub shooting. So in the initial stages, we have the social media messages that are going out for the Pulse nightclub. We have Engine 5 that was made aware that there was a shooting and even dispatched. Now, that lieutenant chose to shelter in place. Now, he's been criticized heavily for it in some ways, but if you think of how we train our personnel, Did he do the right thing or the wrong thing? That's a judgment call. Now, I'll tell you what did happen. They had run a call to the Pulse nightclub just an hour or two before. They knew the number of people that were in there. They knew the situation that happened at that club on a daily basis. And he was hearing gunshots because he was right across the street from it. So he was still hearing gunshots, and he was hearing people bang on those overhead doors. So what he wanted to do, and I know him and I've spoken to him, what he wanted to do was get a handle on the event, call for police assistance to secure the area. Now, that's a lot of the ways that we were taught. In fact, how many have been in the service prior to 1986 or thereabouts? Okay, there's a few. There's a few. So something happened in 1986. For many of us that were in the service around that time, when there was a violent call, a lot of times we used to roll right up into the scene. Well, what happened in 1986 was the promulgation of NFPA 1500. And what 1500 said was, you don't go into a violent scene. You stage, many times in the direction of travel, and you wait for that scene to be secured by law enforcement. And then you come in. Well, over time, since that time to this, I'm sure you've all dealt with it because I have. What we have is we have calls that are termed as violent calls. And it could be a domestic call. And then when you follow up, yeah, it was a domestic call, but the perpetrator left last night. And now it's 1 day removed. And we're staging. So that there has to be, some middle ground there to where we can assess a little bit better and get into the scenes where we can have a chance to have a positive effect. Now, just like most calls, when you have a large amount of patients, you institute MCI procedures or mass casualty incident procedures. And that happened this night because really our role in an active shooter, this is one of the major portions of our role, is to do the mass casualty incident. So that happened this night. And what you see is Rescue 7, Orlando Rescue 7 was the first unit to show up on scene. Now, what happened was that they were at the hospital and they had been dropping off a patient and they didn't get the message to stage. Or they disregarded the message to stage, and there's still debate on whether that happened or whether it didn't happen. But they went to the scene. Now you can see where the initial staging was, several blocks away from the nightclub. So you can see at 2:15 the staging was way up there. It got called in closer. But one thing that happened was they actually designated one block around the nightclub as the hot zone. So, and I believe that's, let me see if I can get that. I believe that's on that one. So what does that represent when you say one block, one city block as a hot zone? So in our world, a hot zone is the IDLH. Or in an active shooter, the hot zone is the area of immediate threat or danger. And generally, fire departments, even the ones that use the rescue task force concept, they don't go into hot zones. So this is where we're going to talk about how do we designate those zones and how do we make them flexible to give us the best operational advantage going forward. So you see over the next 42 minutes, 38 patients were processed and transported to the Level 1 Trauma Center and 6 surgeons within those operating rooms. I can tell you one of the things that went very well was hospital operations. They were able to ramp up very, very quickly, process the patients quickly, get them to definitive care, to surgery when they needed to. And of those that made it to the hospital, most of them survived. I believe there was only 1 or 2 that didn't survive after making it to the hospital. Now, you can see what the map represents as well. So the incident command posts were set up. And so what we have is, you see the staging area now closer to the station. You see the unified command was close to the triage area. Now, you also see represented on the map the fire command post. So can you have a unified command when the fire command post is not an integral portion of it? So what they called unified command that night was law enforcement unified command. And that had some serious ramifications for the operations of the scene. When it comes to, just looking through NFPA 1500, we're obligated in these types of violent scenes to have that face-to-face communication, to have a unified command post. We're obligated to do a lot of these things. So you see the first patient was transported by Rescue 7. Now what happened was, while we did have staging there was units. I had a unit that transported 3 or 4 times. So when sometimes those units get caught in a vortex, right? They drop off, they go back, and they're designated again to take somebody else. And that happened with several of the units. Although we had resources at the scene, one of the things we could have done better is how we manage those resources, how we take them from staging to transport in order to get the patients out and to really spread some of the wealth when it comes to patient care. Now, our initial dispatch was at 2:26. We responded with 19 units, 41 personnel. We had our battalion chief assigned to staging. Our assistant chief went and was in support of the fire incident commander from Orlando. Now, I can tell you, made suggestions, but it was their scene. Made suggestions for unified command. Their scene. Made suggestions to use ballistic protection. Those things, and it just is. That's not the way that any of us were trained to do it, but that's what happened that night. Now, some of the things that went well is having the number of captains. Our captains don't ride on any of our operational units. So the way we're set up is we have 7 battalions, and I kind of have the battalion set up as self-contained units with a battalion chief and a captain as the number 2. And they both have individual units. So within each battalion, a captain serves as an EMS officer as well as the safety officer for any of our incidents. So they have their individual vehicles. So we were able to spread them out to different parts of the scene to really manage different components of the scene. And that paid dividends certainly for us. We also brought to bear our MCI trailer, which that has a capability for 250 patients. It's a semi-tractor trailer, as well as some of the other units you see there. Now, many of our responsibilities had to do with patient care, the triage, the transport, and certainly the MCI, or resupplying everybody in the initial stages of the scene. Now, you see as the scene progresses, some of the things that went well, when you have a lot of patients, calling public transportation is an option that should be at the fingertips of the incident commander. And that happened here with calling the Lynx bus, which is public transportation. You see some of the other requests there. They asked the special ops unit to ladder the Dunkin' Donuts. That gave them an operational advantage to look onto the backside of the Pulse nightclub, which was the Dunkin' Donuts. Now, they also, at the point, so what transpired in the scene during those first chaotic moments of the scene, it was certainly an active shooter. And then what happened is many of the folks went into the recesses of the club and were in the bathrooms. And the shooter took position in the back side of the nightclub and was kind of pinned down in the back side of the nightclub. So what happened was it transitioned from active shooter to a hostage situation. And then there was some concern of secondary devices because there was some hits by the dogs on the shooter's vehicle. May have been from the ammunition that was carried there, but that was a concern. And so the fire command post was cleared by the dogs, and the police command post decided to relocate what I always say is next to an area where they're comfortable with. Now, you can all make your own assumptions as to why they do that. But that was the reality of that scene. So again, what happens is you don't have a unified command post. You don't have a direct communications links with the incident commander, which is critical in this. And I can tell you that the communications link was a corporal from Orlando Fire Department. had a lapel mic and had an earpiece. So when a question was being asked of him, he would relay the message. That message would go to the communications center, then the communications center to the police command post, from the police command post back to the communications center, back to the corporal that had the little squiggly thing in his ear, so nobody could actually hear the message. We were relying on him giving us his interpretation of what the message was. So in all the things that we were ever taught, that's not effective communications. And that's why it's so critical, and that's why in many of our standards it says unified command, face-to-face communications. And that's something that went horribly wrong on this scene. And it had, I don't believe that it had any ramification on patient outcomes, but certainly when you look at the coordination of the scene, being able to anticipate and prepare for things that were happening on scene, it had some serious ramifications there. Now at 321, the only level 1 trauma center in the county goes on lockdown because there was reports of a potential shooting outside of the hospital. So it goes on lockdown. So this is one of the areas that actually went very well because we had one of the 3 captains that we had on scene. We had put them purposely at the hospital for patient offload. And they were able to coordinate very quickly with the security elements of the hospital as well as a police officer that was there. So within a matter of minutes, it was open again. Which, if now you have to go to the next trauma center, you're talking, it probably was a 20 to 30 mile trek from that area if this would have persisted. But we were able to open it very, very quickly. Now, phase 2, and this is the transition period. And we talked about this a little bit. And so when there was a hit, there was some of the units that were positioned on scene were moved out until it was confirmed that it was safe on scene. So you can see where the units ended up. Staging moved back a little bit. We moved things to comply with the 2-city block parameter. You got to remember to always point that way. Now, between 4:25, you could see this was about 4:25. During that transition period, that's where they were doing hostage negotiations, right? So the patients had been cleared out of the scene. If you can imagine, now you're really resupplying everything. You're getting ready for what you know will be the next wave, because the next wave was coming because you had the hostage situation. And so police had been negotiating with them and trying to get a handle on it. But there was still a significant number of people within the nightclub. So this was all the resupply, and really you could see how the hospital was prepared for that next wave. I keep on pointing that way. So at about 5 a.m., SWAT team enters the Pulse nightclub, and they do it through an explosive breach. Now, we talked about communications. And so the notification that all fire rescue elements got that breach was happening was by the sound of the explosion. Breakdown in communications? Of course it was. It just made a scene that we could have prepared for and could have, been prepared to orderly take in, patients, to almost a whole new chaotic scene. Because we didn't know where the explosion was coming from. You had an outpouring of patients coming out again. And of course, the shooter was put down at this time at 5:17. So in total, we had 117 casualties with 49 deaths. You can see the number of transports. And so one of the things that came out from the Pulse nightclub shooting was many of those transports were done by the police department, and in some cases in the back of pickup trucks. Now there's a couple of things that precipitated that. When they said the hot zone was 1 block, and police said, okay, we have patients, send units in, the incident commander said, we're not sending them in. That's a hot zone. Now you can see how that can really cause some animosity, and that exists to this day. If you see some of the presentations done by the Orlando Police Department, there's a great deal of animosity between them, or there has been. Hopefully it's getting better now, but there's been some animosity because some of those things. And so to me, it's just a matter of, are we training appropriately? Are we considering the right things when we're setting up these scenes, when we're setting up our zones? Of course, within the fire service, when we talk about zones, a lot of times we think about setting up zones in concentric circles. Or we use plume patterns, right, on our hazardous materials incidents, and we do it that way. But an active shooter can be totally different. You could have, a hot zone next to a warm zone, certainly, but you could have a hot zone next to a cold zone. You can have, a warm zone that goes back to being hot. So it's really, how do we train our personnel to deal with this and give them the right training, establish the right level of competencies to train our folks for the different levels of response that we need out of them. Now, some of the considerations and some of the things that we had to deal with, if you saw on one of the slides, and I didn't go over it, but the EOC was activated at almost 3 a.m. I think it was about 2:56 if we were to go back. And that was something that you want to consider very early in these incidents because the active operational part of the incident is just a small portion of what the impact of that incident is going to be. If you think of the 300 people that were in the nightclub at that time. And now we had 117 casualties along with the deaths. How many people is that going to reach out to in your community? Because it's not just the 117 that were impacted, it's all 300, all their family, all their friends that were impacted that are going to be wondering what's happening and looking for their loved ones. So establishing EOC operations early on in the incident could pay dividends. You can see some of the services that were done. Family Assistance Center. When we say ongoing, that can last months, if not years, in a lot of cases. So I can tell you what happened here. The Family Assistance Center changed places 3 times. So you had the original one, and then it went in transition to where it went to the permanent location. Now, the permanent location was kind of a great community story because you all have community partnerships within your communities. We had a building that was a county facility, and I'm going to say it was an unused county facility. If it wasn't a county facility, I would call it an abandoned building. But since it was a county facility, it was an unused facility. So it had been planned for rehab. So Disney came in with all their skilled workers, all their decorators, and they said, "You need it rehabbed? Let us do it." They did it in 48 hours. The entire building, what we would consider was an abandoned building, in 48 hours, they had it done, and families have been using that and are using that to great extent. Now, some of the other things, of course, the health and mental services, not only for the victims, but for our folks as well. And so you really don't realize, unless you live it, how far out the tentacles of this type of event can go. In fact, I was walking around, I was walking in my building a couple of days removed from the event, and I see, and I'm passing people that, some of them worked in finance, some of them worked in HR. They're walking down the halls with tears running down their face because they lost a loved one, or they knew somebody that was in the Pulse event. So when you think of the mental health services, think about the impacts that it has community-wide, and not just for the responders or the victims, but people that are connected, because it does have a ripple effect outside of those that are directly affected. Of course, Red Cross services, transportation and lodging. Now, when we consider transportation and lodging, the Orlando area has the most amount of visitors of any place in the United States. Last year we had 72 million visitors. So what happens is you have international people that need lodging. You have people, had contacts from the Mexican consulate, from the Canadian consulate, from some South American entities as well, that were coming in and trying to find their loved ones. Now that was another piece that was difficult, that really takes some work on the front end to overcome some of these things. When you look at vital redocumentation and the consulates and the burial services and things, so when you're transporting patients to hospitals and they're different hospital systems, and now you're trying to unify the families with the victims, and you're calling around, or one hospital is calling to the other to try and find out the information, what do you think the first thing is that the hospitals are going to cite as the reason that they can't give you that information? Exactly. So these are things that it would behoove you to take care of these things on the front end, so that when you when you send patients, you not only track them appropriately, but you're able to get the information back to their families in a timely manner. So the assistance for businesses and employees, this is an impact that needs to be considered. If you look at the area right around the Pulse nightclub, those businesses were shut down for a couple of weeks during the investigation. And so that has an economic impact. If you look at the Parkland shooting, in the Parkland shooting, the day after the event, that school board came out and said, that brand new 3-story building that had the shooting in it will never be used again. So there's an economic impact to that. So these are all those types of ancillary impacts that you don't really consider. Now, burial services, this is one thing that we took a big part in. In fact, we attended many of the burial services for a lot of the people that were killed. And this is really goes towards, okay, how ingrained are you with your community outreach? And this is a way to really weave yourself into the fabric of your community by going to these things. In fact, we had one young man that was shot in the Pulse nightclub that had been at the fire academy. So his family was very grateful for our presence at his funeral. And in fact, one of the things that we did is we got with one of the local paramedic schools, and we were able to get a scholarship in his name. And his parents, they still contact me from time to time because they still remember that as a, not, of course the death was bad, but the support that they got, they remember that fondly. And then you have the expenditure tracking history, those kind of things. And the number of people that come out during this time as well. I mean, we had everybody come out from the president, you can see Director Comey, Loretta Lynch. You had, and remember at the time, this is when the election cycle was happening. So you had every politician and their mother coming out to really look at it. And for the most part, it went pretty well because there was a pretty strong joint information center, so the communications were being done centrally, but not all the time. Some people took it upon themselves to go off script, and that was kind of difficult. One of the difficult things was because there was such a tight rein on communications, a lot of the responders were kind of getting a little bit upset that their role in the incident wasn't being highlighted. And so, one of the things that I took on personally was to write a letter or an op-ed to the newspaper, really thanking all the first responders for everything they did, because their story wasn't being told because of the constraint on information. And that changed. And certainly, at each and every time that any one of these folks came into town, in order to help our folks recover, we got them to those events. If it was a meeting with Director Comey, we got them to that event. With Loretta Lynch, we got them to that event. With the governor, we got them there. Whether they were on duty or off, we paid them to go because that was part of the recovery process. And when we talk about recovery, that's one thing that, when we talk about our industry and what's happening within our industry with PTSD and a lot of the mental health issues that we're dealing with as an industry, certainly this is something that needs to be considered when you have a large-scale scene with the amount of deaths and the amount of emotional impact that these types of events have. So we had the immediate debriefings, and so we brought in, and we didn't restrict who could go to it, but certainly all the people that responded, all the dispatchers, anybody that was ancillary to the scene, we got them in those immediate debriefings. And then the IF The IFF also sent people from New York City that had dealt with 9/11, from the Boston bombings. They're pretty good about bringing people in to help deal with these types of events, and they're grief counselors and those. And so it's the ongoing impact. So, we had the comfort dogs come in and everything you see up there, and we continue to really push that narrative. In fact, our board just approved a new program for first responders within the county to provide for their mental health. And that goes much beyond active shooter. That is something that we're having to deal with as an industry in many different quarters. Now, what are the lessons learned? So, unified command, that's advocated by everybody. Should have been done, wasn't done. I can tell you that less than a year after it was called the Fiamma shooting within our jurisdiction, to where it was a business that somebody came in, and I was so proud of our folks because they responded, they had their ballistics on, they responded with the officers, were able to get to the patients very, very quickly and give them the best chance at life, rather than staying back and waiting for that thing to develop, because in these traumatic events, seconds really do count. Command officers, making sure that you have adequate command officers to run all your divisions, all your groups. That is essential on getting your hands around the scene in the early stages. And then the command staff notifications, really making sure that everybody that needs to be aware of the scene is aware of the scene, and having a system in place to follow up and really inform everybody that has a need to know. When we talk about communications, we talked about the indirect communication with law enforcement on this scene. That is something that really shouldn't happen, and we've already put provisions in place to make sure that it doesn't. In fact, one of the things that happened in our jurisdiction that had really deteriorated communications over the years was that a lot of police agencies had gone to the encrypted radios, and a lot of fire agencies hadn't. So while we used to be able to communicate with them directly, that doesn't always happen in every jurisdiction. So I was able to have a conversation with the sheriff, get access to those channels, get all of our battalion chiefs and captains. So on an everyday basis, they're communicating with the officers in charge. And I'm glad it did it, because I'm glad I did it not just for the communications piece, but as fire chief, your job is always built on relationships. And as it turns out, the sheriff is my new mayor. So that worked out nice from that perspective. And so he's now hired as the deputy county administrator, somebody that worked for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, that I worked on at a state committee and knows the work that we've been doing on NFPA 3000. And so I've really asked him to be the person that's going to bring the hospital systems together, the school systems together, law enforcement and fire together. I've had meetings with all of those already, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But really, when we talk about communications, having the right number of tactical channels is critical. EMS, making sure that you can track the patients, distribute them appropriately, know what the status of each is. And here's a critical piece for us. One engine company for every 2 rescues. We call rescues our ambulances. And so within our organization, we have 42 stations, and each of the stations has a rescue or an ambulance. And so we ride 2 on the ambulance. What happened that night is when you have a critical patient, you always put more people in the back of the unit. So when you only have 1 engine in support of the number of rescues that we had there, you had people from other jurisdictions getting in each other's units, which on the surface isn't a bad thing, but when it comes to familiarity with the equipment, where the equipment's located, we believe it's a much better methodology if you have your own folks that work together every day in support of the people that are going to be doing the transports. Now, equipment. This is where my thoughts had evolved on this as to the deployment of ballistics. And, there's many ways to skin that cat. You could have it on your battalion units. You could have it at a central location. I chose to put it on the riding seats of each unit. And a lot of people's thoughts are changing on it, because if you remember, gosh, it's been a couple of years now, there was the shooting at the Fort Lauderdale airport. And so some of the folks that responded to that shooting had the methodology of having them on their battalion units. Well, they went to assemble the rescue task forces, and the battalion units were assigned to a different division. So you didn't have your ballistics where you needed them. So that's just an individual consideration. Now, one of the things that I did after the event is I started researching all the events that had happened before and looking at what are those common after action issues. So what we found was no communication interoperability. That was very common amongst many of the incidents. No responder integration or the rescue task forces. And if you think of the ones that we talked about, that was some of the deficit on a lot of the major events that had happened in the United States in regard to active shooter. Waited too long for my ambulances. That's Aurora, Colorado. Now, that was twofold. Well, one was that they didn't want to go, there was a perception that they didn't want to go into the scene. And the other one was that they couldn't get into the scene. And the reason they couldn't get into the scene was because you had police clogging the scene. So one of the considerations and one of the recommendations within NFPA 3000 is that you have some transport corridors built in, or in that coordination with the other public safety agencies that are going to come to bear, whether it be single service EMS, law enforcement, any of those, is to keep a pathway clear. That becomes even more important when you're talking about school shootings, because not only are you going to have all those entities coming, you're going to have every parent coming to the school as well. So every corridor into the school and out of the school has the potential of being clogged without a good plan on the front end. Lack of unified command, we talked about. Public information, where to go, what they should do. Oh, I'm sorry. Unable to locate loved ones, lack of tools and equipment, lack of training resources. So a lot of these things are available to us now as a service, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So the other thing that I did, I was like, okay, what should we be doing as an organization? What is industry best practice? So when I looked at that, there was an alphabet soup of model procedures, best practice, guidance from the IAFF, the IAFC, the Metro Chiefs, which I participated in, two of the ones that are up there, DHS, Interagency Group, Hartford Consensus. There was just a bunch of schools of thought out there, and they were all very similar, but they had some differences with them in them as well. So, I thought with all the events that were happening, now was the time to really get these and try to synthesize them into something that we can all kind of look at, into a standard, so we can point to and say, okay, this is how we should be structuring our responses to active shooter. And so that was really the genesis behind NFPA 3000. I happened to be, at the time, in a very good position to be able to push this forward. As the president of the Metro, being involved with the IFC, I was president of the Florida Fire Chiefs at the time. I was able to get a group of people together from the IFF, the IFC, the Metro, the U.S. Fire Administration, and I was able to get them to support my proposal to NFPA to create the first ever active shooter standard, which became NFPA 3000. Now, why NFPA? Because it's time-tested, process, accredited, all those things. Now, what's the difficulty with it? Well, the difficulty with it is that second letter of that acronym, FIRE, makes it very difficult to be accepted amongst law enforcement agencies, or has the potential to, if you don't break down those barriers. So when I submitted the proposal, it needed to go out for public comment. It got the most public comment in the 124-year history of the NFPA. It got the most applications in the history of the NFPA, and they have over 300 standards. We had something like 18 physicians that applied to be on the technical committee. So as it sits today, it's a 50-member technical committee. And really, to Jim Pauley, who's the president of the NFPA, to his credit, what he told me and what he has told the fire service is that the NFPA goes where the fire service goes. And in this case, he stood behind that because there was no limit on the number of committee members that were allowed to sit on this committee. And so what we wanted to do to truly make it a relevant standard was make it a cross-functional standard. That we had law enforcement at the table. We had fire. We had EMS agencies. A lot of times it's fire-based, but a lot of times it isn't. And so we have representatives from, of course, the alphabet soup down there, but you have people at all levels. You have not only frontline personnel, you have administrative in the form of fire chiefs, you have special ops folks, you have at the law enforcement level, you have the federal government, you have state governments, you have EM people from counties and cities, you have people representing universities, representing schools, facility managers. So you have the labor unions from all three of those entities. You have labor unions on the police side, on the fire side certainly, and single service EMS. You have the hospital systems involved there. And so the unique thing about this is bringing all those people together and having those disparate points of view. It's hard enough when we get firefighters in a room, right? And now you get all these people in a room. Our first meeting, that all these people were in the room, we spent 40 minutes arguing about what the standard should be called. No productive work other than trying to name it. So I kind of called a timeout and I said, well, let's build it and then we'll name it on the back end. And that's what we did. And so I'm really gratified of how that came together. And so one of the things that we do each and every time that we hold a meeting, the first thing that we do is we always look around the room and we say, who's not at the table that needs to be here in order to make this as relevant a standard to public safety, to communities as it can be. So we continue to add people to the committee in areas that we may feel there's some deficit of knowledge base, or just to have the buy-in so that the standard could be held to a higher level of credibility amongst these agencies. So who can use it as a resource? All of those that are before you can use it as a resource. There's something in NFPA for all of these groups. Now, the four main concepts is that it's a whole community approach. And that we try to put into every chapter of it: an integrated response, unified command, and planned recovery. And when we talk about recovery, we'll talk about, it's kind of like when you're running a large-scale incident, they always tell you, okay, as soon as you get all the resources you want, or in the very initial stages, start figuring out your demode plan, right? So start figuring out your recovery in the initial stages as well. So when we look at the chapters, this is where it sits today. this is not where it will remain. We're going to, in fact, in our last meeting that we held in New Orleans, one of the things that we're focusing on is really getting all the information on schools, because a lot of us are dealing with, people wanting to do things in schools that go against years of fire codes and years of provisions that had been in there to keep our kids safe. And I'll go over that in a little bit. But you can see a wide variety of chapters there. And so here's what you should know about NFPA 3000. It's about preparedness, response, and recovery. But the specific policies, the tactics, the protocols, those are yours. And those will always be yours. Those will be your police agencies. What NFPA 3000 does is give you the framework to work within. But those specific policies are always going to be locally driven, because there's no way that a standard can know what's impacting your individual communities. Only you know that. So when we look at risk assessment, and this is an area that it kind of touches on when we look at the human impacts, the economic impacts, psychological impacts. Now, there was a fire that happened, back in the 1800s. I think it was the Shirtwaist Fire or something like that. That really was the primer for NFPA to be established. And so what that happened, what that writer did in really advocating for fire safety at the time, was talked about how this fire impacted so many people, left people that were the breadwinners for their families, took them out of the picture so that now that family had to go on to social services. And for those that did survive, they would never be as productive as they were in the past. So I actually took that and replaced an active shooter. I kind of layered it on top and used the same language, and it fits almost perfectly. So one of the things that we'll be doing with NFPA 3000, and part of the NFPA's research arm, is they're going to look at the actual human impacts, economic impacts, and psychological impacts. Because what happens when you try and implement a program of this size and scope within your community, a lot of times they'll say, well, we're not at risk, or we can't afford to do it, right? So what we're going to do the research on is really to show you can't afford not to do it because of the long-term impacts that it could have on a community. If you think of the buildings that these are in, the Pulse building right now sits empty. The Parkland school building sits empty. Just those hard costs for those buildings. But what about the overall economic impact of it? All the workers, where did they go? The impact on social services. The impact from the mental health impact to our firefighters and police officers that now go out on disability retirement in some cases. These are all impacts that really, I believe, can be quantified, and research is going to happen to really look at that going forward. So you look at high occupancy, easy access. We'll get into some of that. So one of the things when we're looking at NFPA 3000, we really wanted to establish it. Certainly, it's called the active shooter hostile event. Well, what are those events that could befall us? Certainly active shooter, IEDs, ramming, civil unrest. And so the standard is on a 3-year revision cycle. So that means when the next one comes, or the one that we believe we may have an exposure to, we have the ability to put it into NFPA 3000. And one that I got a presentation on just last month was elevated terrorism, or terrorism in high-rise structures. And if you think of what happens in a high-rise structure, you could have a couple thousand people in a high-rise structure, right? And they're very vulnerable because if they take the bottom floor or one of the interim floors, nobody can make their way out. So we're looking at those types of things as well. So what are the probabilities or vulnerabilities of an attack within your jurisdiction? So we look at probabilities of an attack occurring as well as the consequences. So in Chapter 5, we're advocating that we identify the threats, do a risk assessment of your communities to assess what the hazards are there, where you have the vulnerabilities, where along this matrix some of the buildings within your communities lie. Many of you have seen this, and certainly if if it's a low probability, low consequence, then that's something that you can deal with as a community. Now, a high probability, high consequence establishes your maximum risk, and of course you could see the different variations there. Now, what's going to happen? Can you identify the locations where you're most susceptible to a hostile event within your community that's going to produce the greatest amount of damage, the greatest amount of death, injuries? When I told you that I had gone and spoken about the UASI funding, well, one of the things that I said to them, I go, if you think of all the tourism that comes to the Orlando area, 72 million, you extrapolate that by 365 days, that comes up to, I don't know, close to 140, 150, 180 a day. But everybody stays on average 2.5 days. That's adding 500,000 population a day to our area, which in Florida, that would make it the second largest city. Now, if you take the Pulse incident, and what is Orlando known for? It's known for being the happiest place on earth. You have Disney, you have Universal Studios, Mickey Mouse, Harry Potter, all the rest there. Now, if you have an incident in one of those places that in many quarters is looked at as a slice of Americana, you not only have the economic impact, but you have the psychological impact. For any of you that have been on International Drive, that's like 20 miles away from where the Pulse incident happened. If this incident would have happened there, we would have had double the amount of deaths. So really, where are those areas within your jurisdictions that you're most susceptible to having the most damage? And how do you prepare for them? And really, it's looking at, okay, what are the demographics and some of these things, critical infrastructure, transportation, all those things that are relevant to doing a threat assessment. And when you look at the risk levels, it goes from very high to low. And so what we're advocating within the standard is to do these risk assessments. And in fact, as fire service organizations, we do them today. How many of us do PIPs? How many of us do inspections of our facilities? How many of us look at, extremely hazardous substances within our communities? But we're looking at it from a single service perspective. So when we're looking at active shooter, what we're advocating is that these risk assessments be done as a team. Coordinate with law enforcement. Coordinate with some of your facility managers. Coordinate with elements of the hospitals, of emergency management, some of the others, in order to get the best assessment possible. So you can see those that are most susceptible to those that become less susceptible, with the lowest risk being the 1 and 2 family dwellings. But the Pulse incident would probably be a medium risk. And some of the other ones that happen would probably fall in the medium risk categories. So when you do your threat assessments, plan for the next one. What do you envision as that being most susceptible within your community? What does the data show? What are the things that are happening, or what are the trends that are happening within the industry? There's a lot of resources out there to plan for these things. How many are familiar with JCAT? JCAT is the Joint Counterterrorism Team out of Washington, D.C. And what they do is they put together products. So if you just look at it, you can see if you have a stadium or a concert venue, or there's a threat of a high-angle shooting like there was in Vegas, what they do is they have recommendations on how to prepare for those on the front end. How to put together your plan for a lot of those, especially with the open access events. We all have a lot of the 5Ks or marathons, parades, those kind of things that we can be susceptible to. And here's just a quick checklist of those things that you can look at when you're looking at your threat assessments. And some of the most common risk factors. One of the things that happened after the Parkland shooting, or Marjory Stoneman Douglas high school shooting, was they put a commission together. And they really looked at, what should they have been looking at to avert the event, and so they are looking at some of the emotional issues. How do you deal with kids within your community that may be high risk? In fact, one of the things I was asked to present before that commission, so I took the drive down, and so when I sat before the commission, I gave them an abbreviated presentation of NFPA 3000. And one of the things that I noticed at the commission is it's made up of some school superintendents, some elected officials, and county sheriffs. The only fire person in the room was me. None sat on that commission. So one of the things that I told them when, one of the premises behind NFPA 3000 is that you have to have everybody at the table if you're going to get to the best place. And that didn't happen with that commission, but they are coming out with some recommendations, I believe. Their report's out, it's available, and I think it's everything from arming teachers to doing, all kinds of different things there. So you can see some of these things. These are all things that should be monitored through your intelligence agencies or your police agencies if they're not doing it already. So planning and coordination. We talked about how it should be a multidisciplined approach to the planning. If you're going to be able to establish the best plan available, then you need all those people at the table that are going to be relevant to establishing that plan. And really the 4-step process. What are the gaps? Plan development, implementation, and evaluation. So now you see some of the planning and coordination elements here. Developing those SOPs or looking at the ones that you have now. Incident command. Are you practicing the incident command? So let me ask a question of the group. How many have trained on active shooter within the last year? Okay. Okay. Now, how many have trained on active shooter twice within the last year? Okay. Less hands. 3 times within the last, I'm going to get your hands to go down in a second. I'm going to keep on going. But you can see what I mean. And so really the reason I asked that question, are we great, 6 times. So the reason I asked that question is if we're going to get to the level to where we're able to provide for our communities in the best manner possible, then it has to be muscle memory for us. It has to be something that is as native to us as responding to an EMS call, responding to a fire call, responding to a hazmat. Are we all hazards or are we not? So it's really through that planning and coordination that you get there. Now when we talk about that active shooter training, are we training on RTF or are we training at the incident command level or both? Because I believe you need to train at all levels of the organization in order to do that. And there's resources out there that give you the ability to do that. Now, unified command, and this should be a fairly simple concept for us. We've been doing incident command going back to fire scope in the 70s, and then the double I NIMS, and down now to the single I NIMS, right? So we know this portion of it. Now, what happens, and I'll tell you because I've seen it, and I've seen it play out in the rooms that we've been bringing our law enforcement brethren in, is that the fire service can be incident command snobs. We believe it should be done one way. Now, police agencies have a different view. Not necessarily wrong, not necessarily right, just different. And so we need to have an understanding of what that view is to really have the appropriate training and to have our expectations meet reality. So early integration is critical. What we don't want, and this is a gap that has been identified, is, do we want our people standing outside waiting? Now, I can tell you this was an argument within the committee because, and so you may have a different view on it, and I certainly have one that I'm going to share, but there was some fire chiefs that firmly believed that the fire service's place is in the cold zone. Bring them to us. There's others, which I'm a part of, that believe that if we're going to give our community the best chance at survival, then our place is in the warm zone. Then there's others that believe operating within the hot zone is where they should be. And within the standard, they can all be right. Because what we've done within the standard is we built it in such a way, and the way I describe it, it's an umbrella that everybody can stand under comfortably. And if you think of the hazmat standard, if you don't have a hazmat team, what do you train your people to? The awareness level, right? And then you can train to the technician level and above, and the operations level. So that's something that we're kind of building the standard that way. But incident command is the linchpin behind everything else that we're doing. A strong incident command at the beginning and throughout the incident is critical. And when we explain it, we're not trying to take over incident command. If they're your resources, you command your resources, but in the scope of a coordinated effort, which, this is kind of preaching to the choir when we talk about incident command. But when you look at active shooter, this is an active shooter checklist. Now, some police agencies, when we look at active shooter, the premise that we're going behind is if you stop the killing, you stop the dying. So police are being trained for those first elements to go in and confront the shooter, take out the shooter, right? So what we just need to know is which one's it going to be? Who's going to be command? Who can we go to? And somewhere along that matrix, whether it's the first arriving, second arriving law enforcement, third arriving, or whatever, just tell us how you operate. If you tell us how you operate, then we can adapt our systems, and we can have those systems coordinate very well. And so it may look different for every law enforcement, but these are some of the considerations. And of course, this is on the fire side. And then staging is something that generally police agencies that's not something that they generally do. So they're really going to look to you, or you can actually provide them with some valuable information on how to accomplish staging in the right way. And then, of course, joint information is critical. Now, facility preparedness. This is one that, how are we providing the resources to those facilities that are at risk within our communities, those high-risk facilities, in order for them to prepare themselves. And if you look at this is critical. The last little bullet there, the notification process, a unique notification process. If I were to ask everybody in this room if you could put a unique ringtone on your phone for each caller, most of you would say yes, you could do it. The technology's there to have a unique notification system within each occupancy. Now, here's where the challenge comes in. If you look at schools, in Florida, there's 67 counties. Some well-to-do counties, some not so much. And within each of those counties, schools are built at all different times, from your elementary schools to your middle schools to your high schools. So each system within there is a little bit different. And what else happens in government when you bid out a project? What system do you get? That's right. Well, we don't like to say cheapest, we say low bid, right? But it's the cheapest one. So what happens with that? There's systems that have the capability, but they weren't bought with the capability to do the things that we're advocating. And this would really solve some of the issues with schools that we've been talking about. So these are some of the things within those facility preparedness things that we're advocating within the standard. And there are things that you've seen before. See something, say something, pretty simple. Run, hide, fight. Is it as simple as just telling somebody to run, hide, fight? Are you telling them where they should run to? Because if they don't know, then they're at risk. In fact, if you've seen the video of the Fort Lauderdale shooting, people were trying to run and hide. The shooting happened there. They ran to here and hid behind this chair. And that's on video. So when we're going out and we're making our community presentations and we're advocating run, hide, fight, we need to go a little bit deeper. We need to tell them where to run. What's an appropriate hiding place? And then what can you use if you have to fight? And those are all things that we can get better at. I think we can all agree on that. Because they truly are the first responders. The ones that are going to be able to have the most impact when you're talking about stop the bleed and all these other things are the people that are closest to the event. And a lot of these events happen very, very quickly. Most active shooters are over before our units get on scene. There's some that extend, but generally about 6 minutes, and most of them are over already. So stop the bleed, that's something that many communities are putting them in with AEDs. I have a meeting, I believe, 2 weeks from now with the hospital and the school board. They're providing the kits for the classrooms or for the schools, and where are we going to put them in the schools. I think that's a great place. What I told my folks is, okay, give me a GIS map of where all my AEDs are, because I wanted to know, are the Stop the Bleed kits going to be beneficial in those AEDs? So an overlay of the AEDs versus our traumatic calls, see how they align. Are you putting them in the right place, or should they be going in convenience stores or gas stations or where your actual events are happening? And you have the data within your systems to be able to determine that. Now, school safety. This is the reason I went to the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Commission. And so what the data shows is that in each of the last 10 years, each calendar year, 5,000 fires. But what they'll tell you, and what they said to me was, nobody has died in a fire, no child has died in a fire in the last 50 years. That's what they told me. And I go, there's good reason for that, because of all the fire codes that we put in. But we're still having fires every day. Not all schools are Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. We have some old school stock that could be susceptible to fire. But can they coexist? Can fire codes and the safety of our children coexist? Of course they can. There's some very simple things that we can do within our schools. So within the schools, one of the simplest things, and one of the data points that I thought was pretty remarkable, is that, did you know that not one person was killed in an active shooter that was behind a locked door? Not one. So let's put locks on the door. But not the type that would restrict us in a fire. In your hotel room, if you're staying in this building, they have the lock where you can just push the lock at night, right? And it locks the door from the outside. From the inside, you grab that handle and you're able to get out. Those are about $250. Now, if you have to put it on every door in every classroom across every school within your jurisdiction, it could be a lot, but a lot less than a lot of the other ramifications. Now, that's just one type. If you took just a regular deadbolt that could be opened from the inside, and there could be a key somewhere in the school, those run about $80. And remember, nobody's ever been killed behind a locked door. They move on to the next one. So some very simple things on how they coexist. I was asked to do an interview with a local news station on whether I would advocate for putting fire hose on the backside of a door. And some people are doing that. And I go, I'm not going to do the interview because it's against the code. And at our core, we have to be code advocates. We have to find those ways that can have our fire codes that have been established over years. And in fact, many of you know this to be true, that our fire codes are hard-fought codes that really come on the heels of significant events in our history. So if you see the major fires that happen, you have the fire code provisions that come after them. So now's the perfect time to really get with your local communities, have those conversations early and often, and begin to utilize that expertise that are found that really can be brought to bear to find a solution that's right for each one of your communities. Because for each one, it may be a little bit different depending on your situation. Now, this is the challenge, right? To blend fire safety with school safety. But there are things that can be done. They talk about pull stations. Well, you can take pull stations out if you have the proper systems in place. If you have a sprinkler system, you could take, and I'm not a code guy, but this is what my code guy told me. And I have looked at some of this, but there are ways to provide for the safety within schools without impacting the safety during a fire. Now, communications, the coordination with your communications center, are they tracking? Do they have the coordination with each other, with the hospitals? Are they going to put you on, do you have that communications plan on the front end? Do you have the relationships and the interoperability? Now, law enforcement competencies. This is something that was a hard-fought thing because when we talk about standards, police agencies generally don't have standards. They're all based on individual policy. So when you look at NFPA, there's shall language and there's may language. Shall language means it's a standard. May, it's not a standard. So we got to the 11th hour and police wanted to strip out all the shall language out of the standard. And we were able to get a lot of the shall language left in, not as much as we would like, but enough to make it a standard. So the competencies and how we're building the standard is based on the events and based on where you're going to be operating within that event. So when we look at the fire side, so what we do, if you can imagine a matrix, where along one side it has the type of event, whether it be active shooter, IED, ramming, and then it has the zone that you'll be operating in, cold zone, warm zone, hot zone. And then the competencies are based on where you choose as an organization that you should be operating. So if you believe you should be operating in a cold zone for an active shooter, then train to those competencies. If you believe that you should be operating in the warm zone, then you train to those competencies for each one of those types of events. And that's really how we got the group to really come together, because there was differing points of view. And so, and of course, your viewpoint changes as you get more information. So some people that believe that their place was in the cold zone, they're starting to shift their mindsets. And certainly the reason that I believe that we should be operating in the warm zone is because I truly love our fire service and don't want to see anything that detracts from our place in our community. And I believe this is one of those things that if we're found waiting on the outside for 45 minutes to an hour, while people that don't know our job as well as we do are charged with removing patients and bringing them to us, I believe we can lose standing within our communities. So when we look at personal protective equipment, this is what is the requirement within the standard. And when I say requirement, it goes by zone. If you're operating in the warm zone, you don't need, or in the cold zone, you don't need ballistics. But if you're going to have rescue task forces, then you need to provide the ballistics. And the minimum is the level 3A. Now, they're expensive. And they have a 5-year lifespan. And so it becomes somewhat of a challenge. Where do you want to put your priorities versus some of the other resource needs that you have within your departments or within your communities? So I was at a meeting and I got to sit on the grant criteria development for the AFG grant, for the SAFER grant, and the fire prevention grant. And so ballistics was put as a medium priority. Well, I was fighting to have it put on there as a high priority. And what they said was that there's other grants available to fire rescue agencies. And so there's so many needs within the fire service that the group decided that it should stay as a medium priority. I can tell you that within the AFG, if you submit for ballistics, it's probably a wasted submission, because very few medium priority items, if any, ever get funded. Now, I took them at their word. I said, okay, well, let me do the research. Let's find out. Well, I didn't do the research. I sent it to the IFC and I said, do the research for me. And they did. And what they came back with was that, in fact, fire rescue agencies can procure ballistic equipment through their Homeland Security grant programs, their state Homeland Security grant programs. Now, there's a caveat to that. The caveat is it has to be included as part of your state THIRA, or your threat assessments. If not, then it's not available to you. So while they said it's available, it may or may not be available. Then there's some other grants that are out there. In fact, when I asked the IFC to do the research on it, we're going to be putting something out to everybody so that they know where that is. And we'll be advocating to get included as part of the DOJ grants. Because within the DOJ, or the Department of Justice, our police agencies can procure ballistics and get 50% of the cost picked up by the Department of Justice. But it's only for police agencies at this point. So what we'll be advocating through legislation is to have fire agencies that are training with their police agencies on active shooter response to have that same ability. And then there's one other one that's for rural departments. It's an agriculture grant that has money available as well. And if any of you want information on that, I'll leave some of my cards and you can certainly contact me, and I'm happy to provide those. Now, when we talk about response within a hot, warm, and cold zone, and we talk about the RTF concept, it's really force protection, going in, removing victims. And so you can see we still have the basic MCI set up, but you can have a hot zone very in close proximity to a warm zone. Now, these can be fluid as well. When we talked about concentric circles, your police can go in and establish a warm zone corridor for you to extricate patients. It's just a matter of how you want to work with your police agencies to have the best effect within your communities. Now, here's one that I personally like. Well, when we look at hot zone operations, as far as the fire service, in a hot zone, that's where you're going to have your special tactics teams, your SWAT medics, those kinds of things. But SWAT medics generally aren't there to provide for the victims of a shooting. They're there to provide for the police officers. Now, where I believe we can have the greatest effect is a rescue task force within the warm zone. And this is where we're going to have the best opportunity to stop the killing and stop the dying within active shooter events. And then the cold zone is generally where you have your unified command post, a lot of your staging elements and investigative elements as well. So when we look at a rescue task force, what are we trying to accomplish? And a lot of this came about from the Hartford consensus, threat suppression, hemorrhage control, rapid extrication, a pretty simple narrative. And really, it's force protection, going in, doing some very rudimentary things, and extricating people, whether it be bleeding control, clotting mechanisms, tourniquets, those kind of things. And like I said, it came from the Hartford consensus. Now, what must we do in our training? The training has to be predicated based on the risk assessments within your community. We have to test it on a regular basis. We have to practice it. We have to make it muscle memory for our service if we're going to do it. And we have to make the financial commitment and make the time available to do it. And I know our training calendars get filled up pretty quick when we're trying to meet ISO requirements, accreditation requirements, state requirements, but this is something that I believe is critical to our service. Now, when we talk about mass notification, certainly social media getting that word out very quickly. How are people absorbing information now? They're absorbing it in small bites. They're not necessarily looking at the news channels. They're looking at social media. They're looking at, different types of emergency notifications. So really, what is going to be the most effective for your community? And that's really based on knowing your community as well. Now, the hospitals, the communications with the hospitals on the front end to facilitate that victim identification, working with the facility securities. I can tell you that with ORMC, we've worked very closely with that level 1 trauma center because they are susceptible to having a shooting within there that can really put the county out of business. So just the other day, we had a suspected gunman in the hospital, the only level 1 trauma center in the county. The medical director called me and he goes, "Chief, can you kind of keep your units away for a little bit?" So they were able to segregate, not the entire building, but a portion of the building where that person was located, and they were still able to bring patients in to some of the other trauma rooms, the critical patients, but it was a coordinated effort between law enforcement, hospital security, and fire rescue to make that happen. And now when we talk about the phases of the recovery, it's the immediate recovery. What's happening in those initial stages of the incident that you need to take care of for your personnel, for your community. The early recovery and the continued recovery is, in many cases, those things that are happening as far as recovery take months and months and could, outlast the incident, certainly, and really have long-term effects. That's why you need to consider those recovery elements within your planning processes, especially bringing your emergency management elements into the process early in order to really kind of quantify what those elements will be and how you'll provide for them. So if you want to know more, please look up NFPA 3000. I'll be available to you at any time. Really look at the components that are relevant to your community because they're not all going to be relevant to your community. But take those things within that framework that will help you to establish a plan that's right for what you're dealing with within each one of your communities. Thank you for your time and attention, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Chief Drozd, thank you very much for the words and the good information. It's something that we can all certainly use. On behalf of the South Carolina State Firemen's Association, we'd like to offer you the little token.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Again.
Thank you.